Fantastic, that's all, isn't it? Also, good evening, welcome. I'm Jonathan Tomlinson, the Assistant Director of the Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the Canadian Institute in Greece for the third event of this occasion. This evening, we're pleased to host a lecture by independent scholar Emma Tate. Emma has a BA in Classics and History from Ohio Wesleyan University and an MA in Classics from the University of British Columbia, with a thesis entitled "A Spectre is Haunting Epic, a close reading of the Apparition Topos of Lucan's Bellum Civile." Emma works primarily on Roman epic and secondarily on ancient attitudes towards the afterlife. Her recent publications include co-authoring the Oxford Bibliography Online entry for Seneca's Oedipus and her own translation of a collection from Ovid's Heroides in the journal Minerva. She's also co-authored a chapter called Just Deserts in the Ancient Pagan Afterlife, forthcoming in a Cambridge Companion on the Medieval Afterlife. She's currently working on a series of essays on topics in ancient horror, but tonight she'll speak to us about dreams, ghosts and gods, the Apparition Topos in Roman epic.
This talk will be an adaptation of my thesis work, which I actually haven't had a chance to present publicly yet, so I'm going to share it with you. So yes, my talk will be on dreams, ghosts, and gods. In the world of Greek and Latin epic poetry, supernatural apparitions loom large. The epic genre has its own lexicon of topoi, or literary commonplaces. You might be familiar with some set-piece scenes already. Think Councils of the Gods on Olympus, or a lengthy catalog of troops. Supernatural encounters are one of these epic set-pieces. Apparitions enter the landscape as unnatural visitors, emissaries from the world beyond. They approach in liminal spaces and times, in the ambivalent hours of dusk and dawn, at the crossroads of wakefulness and sleep, bringing wonder and terror to those whom they visit. From their hazy origins in Homer's Patroclus to the more terrifying ghosts of Statius and Silius Italicus, apparitions are a universal element in Greco-Roman epic. Traditionally, when looking at apparition scenes, scholars have made heavy use of the classicist's favorite instruments, rigorous subdivision and categorization. Epic apparitions have traditionally been divided into three separate topoi: the epic dream topos, the haunting topos, and the divine messenger topos. The epic dream topos deals with supernatural visions in sleep. The haunting topos features visitations of ghosts to the living. And finally, the divine messenger topos centers on epiphanies, episodes in which immortal beings reveal themselves to humans. While scholars writing on their topos of choice do make passing references to the related topoi, these examinations are often developed in relative isolation from each other. But this differentiation between dreams and ghosts and gods is a distinctly modern preference. In fact, a brief study of Greek and Latin words for apparitions reveals few functional differences between different types of supernatural entities. The Greek words daimon, phasma, and eidolon can refer variously to ghosts, gods, and supernatural beings. Latin shows the same flexibility. Monstrum can refer to religious portents, prodigies of nature, or ghosts. And imago can refer not only to spirits of the dead, but also to false phantoms of humans fashioned by the gods. This is not to suggest that these terms are interchangeable, but rather that this intersectionality of meaning reveals reveals a highly syncretistic model of ancient thought on supernatural beings. So, I argue, we should take a holistic approach to epic apparition events as well, comparing scenes of all three types to reach a fuller understanding of the passage in question. Rather than splitting apparition scenes into ghost scenes or dream scenes or epiphany scenes, I propose a new and broader apparition topos, which encompasses all of them. This unification allows space for different types of manifestation more clearly to inform one another. So, how is this useful? To illustrate on a literary level, I'll address some issues with previous attempts to categorize an apparition episode. This one will be from Lucan's Bellum Civile. To give some brief context on the poem, the Bellum Civile, or Civil War, was written by the poet Lucan during the reign of Nero. It is a historical epic about the civil war between Julius Caesar and the forces of the Roman Senate, led by Pompey the Great. In the scene that we'll be looking at tonight, Caesar is just about to cross the Rubicon. A fateful moment in 49 BCE, which launches the Civil War. A personification of the city of Rome appears before him and begs him to go no further. This is actually the only art I could find of this incredible scene, which makes me really sad. It's a really cool moment. Since the passage is short, and we'll be looking at it in depth, I'll read the English now. I've also included the English and Latin text on your handout if you'd like to follow along. All English translations of Lucan, by the way, are from Suzanne Braun's 1992. Now swiftly Caesar had surmounted the icy Alps, and in his mind conceived immense upheavals, coming war. When he reached the water of the little Rubicon, clearly to lead her through the murky night appeared, a mighty image of his country in distress, grief in her face, her white hair streaming from her tower-crowned head. With tresses torn and shoulders bare, she stood before him, and sighing, said, "Where further do you march? Where do you take my standards, warriors? If lawfully you come, if as citizens, this far only is allowed." Then trembling struck the leader's limbs. His hair grew stiff, and weakness checked his progress, holding his feet at the river's edge. At last, he speaks. "O thunderer, surveying great Rome's walls from the Tarpeian rock. O Phrygian house gods of Iulus' clan and mysteries of Quirinus, who is carried off to heaven. O Jupiter of Latium, seated in lofty Alba, and hearts of Vesta. O Rome, the equal of the highest deity, favor my plans. Not with impious weapons do I pursue you. Here am I, Caesar, conqueror by land and sea, your own soldier, everywhere. Now too, if I am permitted. The man who makes you my enemy, it is he will be the guilty one." Then he broke the barriers of war, and through the swollen river quickly took his standards. So one representative scholarly reading of this scene comes to us from M.P.O. Morter. He suggests that Roma is a waking vision which functions as a dream. Of course, this rests on a fairly large leap of logic. This is a dream sequence in which Caesar is not asleep. And if Lucan wanted the scene to function as a dream, he would have had historical sources to accommodate a literal dream sequence. The historians Plutarch and Suetonius both have similar dream sequences for Caesar, and Plutarch even situates his right before the crossing, on the night before the crossing of the Rubicon. So it would have been easy for Lucan to write a scene with Roma visiting the sleeping Caesar in a dream, if the epic dream was his intention. Morford's decision to read the episode as a dream also denies a crucial point of characterization for Lucan's Caesar. He makes the decision to commit this act of incredible sacrilege while he's awake. So his conscious insistence on proceeding with the violation is crucial to Lucan's character. Neil W. Bernstein offers another approach. He assigns the Roma episode to the haunting topos. The imago patriae, the ghost of the fatherland, he concedes, is not, strictly speaking, the ghost of a formerly living individual. However, the presence of a Virgilian model scene and multiple references in Lucan's epic to the death of the patria license the reading as a ghostly epiphany. But Bernstein's reading, again, denies a key aspect of the scene. Roma is not a ghost. A ghost is a formerly flesh and blood human being, often a relative or a loved one of the spectator. While Lucan's Roma does function as a ghost in certain narrative respects, which we'll explore a bit in the talk, she's unarguably not the shade of a formerly living human. Now, my project doesn't seek to revolutionize this area of study. It ultimately supports many of the conclusions of both Morford and Bernstein's readings. But I suggest that it is unhelpful to differentiate between different topoi because the dichotomies separating them, wakefulness versus sleep or ghost versus God, are actually subsidiary to the strong linguistic and thematic elements which unite these scenes. So, what elements make up the apparition topos? What is the formula? Well, each poet molds the topos to his own purpose, shifting the order of the features around, including some, omitting others. No apparition scene includes all 11 elements that I have identified, but if we were to imagine a perfect Platonic ideal of an apparition scene, it would look something like the chart that you have on your handout. The scene opens with the specter's approach, usually in the darkness of night or when the spectator is asleep. The apparition is described as manifesting, quote, before the eyes of the spectator, with language used related to vision. The apparition is also described as, quote, perfectly clear, or clarus, despite potential difficulty with seeing due to darkness or gloom. A description of the apparition is made, with physical details and actions revealing the tone of the entity's message, usually its grief or anger. The apparition then makes its address to the spectator. It identifies itself, reinforcing a personal relation to the spectator. Common roles include a patron god, or a former lover, or a relative. The apparition then announces the immediate circumstances of its appearance. It summarizes where it came from and who sent it and what's going on. It then issues an order to the spectator, usually in the imperative voice. The spectator first reacts to the apparition physically with surprise or fear, and then responds verbally. Sometimes further discussion occurs between the two characters, and sometimes the exchange is limited to the apparition's initial address and then the spectator's response. Once the message is delivered and the interaction is complete, the apparition withdraws. While many of these elements find their origins in Homer's apparition scenes, I argue that this formula was codified in Latin literature by Virgil. The impact of Virgil's Aeneid on later epic cannot be overstated. Our Neronian poet Lucan is widely acknowledged to be responding to him. The close overlap between the apparition elements that are unique to Virgil's telling and those that Lucan chooses to include in his own tellings show that he is looking really closely at the Aeneid as his inspiration. I've chosen to center my work on Lucan in part for this reason. He's situated relatively late in the epic tradition, and he writes with great awareness of the epics which precede him. Epic is an essentially reflective genre. As Philip Hardy summarizes, as a product of the oral tradition, epic has a set towards continuation. From these origins, it also carries with it the habit of repetition, the repetition of verbal formulas, scenes, themes, and structures. It is therefore one of the primary tasks of the ancient epicist to digest previous epics and then refashion those stock elements in his own way. But in a reflective genre, Lucan stands out as an especially reflective poet. He utilizes what John Biagio Conte describes as, quote, a polemical rehandling of Virgilian expressions and situations. Why? Virgil's Aeneid offers a substantial amount of praise to the first Roman emperor, Augustus. An uncharitable reading might even call it Augustan propaganda. I wouldn't call it that, but some people do. But Lucan was writing under Nero, who's a very different emperor. He was, in fact, eventually compelled to commit suicide by Nero at age 25 after being implicated in a conspiracy against the emperor. So, Lucan is a poet in Nero's court, one with, perhaps, an increasingly pessimistic attitude towards imperialism. He inverts many elements in Virgil's Aeneid to undermine Virgil's deception of liberty under a principate. Lucan's treatment of the apparition topos, I argue, mirrors his treatment of other major epic topoi in the Bellum Puellae, like the epic tree-felling topos or the catabasis, which is where the hero goes to the underworld. He inverts elements of all of them. Hardy may have my favorite quote on Lucan's attitude towards Virgil. Lucan takes control of his predecessor's material not as a respectful son entering a father's inheritance, but as a rebel. It's worth noting, however, that Lucan is not monolithic in his anti-Virgilism. He does accommodate many elements of the topos which were favored by Virgil. He shows deference to other epicists too, especially Homer and Ovid. But the apparition topos is well suited for illuminating Lucan's attitudes towards Virgil in particular. Emanuele Narducci writes, in Italian, this is the translation, that Lucan's writing is, in general, sustained by a tone of deep indignation. It is as if Virgil, with his poem, had perpetuated an illusion, covering with an idyllic veil a tragic and disconcerting reality. The end of Roman liberty is the transformation of the old res publica into a tyranny. Through the character of Cata, Lucan even refers to the semblance of liberty under a principate as a ghost, or umbra. So, my apparition topos is an especially qualified vehicle to explore Lucan's frustration with this illusion of Virgil's epic. Armed with this background knowledge, let's get into a close reading using my proposed apparition topos. The setting is a cold night in early January on the banks of the Rubicon. As Caesar prepares to spur his horse into the river, an eerie vision, the personification of Rome herself, appears to him. She glows in the darkness, larger than life, and addresses her soldier. Visible to Caesar alone, she petitions him in a last, desperate attempt to prevent the coming civil war. Lucan's treatment of the Roma scene reveals several concessions to the standard topos, especially where the elements suit his dramatic purpose, but also several deviations. Let's look at the lead-up to the apparition scene first. The preliminaries often cue important information, in this case about the character of Julius Caesar. After 182 lines of narrative delay, the first major action of Lucan's poem occurs. Caesar bursts into the narrative with the very act which bursts the levees of civil war. This is a scene about breaking boundaries. Lucan is obsessed with liminality. One point of significance in the crossing of the Rubicon, a river that is a spatial boundary, has not yet been observed to my knowledge. Entering this liminal area, this space between spaces, also puts Caesar at unique risk of experiencing supernatural phenomena. Supernatural beings exist somewhere between this world and next. They're not quite dead, but they're not quite alive. They're not quite substantial, but they're not immaterial. So as liminal beings, they tend to appear in liminal spaces, like doors, gates, crossroads, and rivers. Thus it makes sense, both narratively and by the rules of the supernatural, that Roma would make her appearance to Caesar here, just as he reaches the boundary between Gaul and Italy, and indeed between peace and war. So in just these few lines, Lucan gives us some foreboding signals. First, he links the crossing of the Alps in line 183 with the crossing of the Rubicon. Who else famously crossed the Alps to invade Italy? Hannibal, yeah. So we have this paradoxical idea of Caesar invading his own country. Lucan is telling us he's a threat. Another foreboding trick word is the word gelidas in line 183. The Latin adjective gelidus means cold. It's often applied to alpine climbs, and to Gaul in particular. So there's a sense of physical coldness here, but also of cold's physical attendant reactions. So think goosebumps and shivering and your hair standing on end. In Latin, gelidus also indirectly implies dread and death. Of the 32 times gelidus appears in the Bellum Civile, 17 are directly related to the experience of dread or death. So before the apparition of Roma even appears, Lucan is kind of playing Jaws music for us. But it's interesting that it's not the shade that's scary, it's not the ghost, it's Caesar. He's transposed that fear onto the unexpected character. So with the preliminaries out of the way, let's get into the scene itself with the approach of the apparition, which is point 1 on the chart. As I've mentioned already, Lucan models his poem heavily on Virgil's Aeneid. This Roma scene is largely modeled on Book 2 of the Aeneid, where Virgil gives us 3 full apparition scenes. Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid, you may remember, features the fall of Troy. The hero, Aeneas, escapes the city with a group of refugees who will go on to found Rome. Lucan is looking at these 3 scenes incredibly closely when he's writing this Roma scene. The first apparition takes place when Aeneas is still sleeping, unaware that the Greeks have breached the walls with the Trojan horse. The ghost of his cousin, Hector, the hero of Troy, appears to him and encourages him to escape. In the second scene, there's a moment where Aeneas sees Helen, who he sees as the cause of the war, and he wants to stick around and kill her. And his mother, Venus, appears and tells him he needs to forget about it and keep moving. I should probably earmark that scene as potentially apocryphal. We're not sure if Virgil actually wrote it, but it follows the topos, so I included it. Finally, the third apparition scene is in Book 2 is the ghost of Aeneas' wife, Creusa. She appears when Aeneas is frantically looking for her in the burning city to tell him that she was already killed in the chaos and that he needs to get out of the city. So, what narrative function do all of these visions share? They all approach Aeneas when he's in a state of intense confusion or vulnerability. He's either ignorant of the danger, or he's willingly putting himself into danger. That is, they all appear at moments when Aeneas is in desperate need of direction. And indeed, it's one of the primary narrative functions of the epic apparition to guide the hero in times of indecision. But in contrast, the beginning of Lucan's scene shows us that his Caesar is wide awake right now. He's calm, he's actively making decisions. The noun motus, in line 184, can carry a sense of political upheaval, but its primary sense is of physical motion. Both senses are at work here. Caesar is in constant, active motion, mentally and physically, in his attack on the Republic. Where Aeneas was young and unsure and panicked at the outset of war, there's no wasted time here with Caesar. He needs no instruction. He lacks restraint, not initiative. So Lucan is inverting everything from Virgil's scenes here. And Roma has to move quickly to stop Caesar. She appears suddenly, as Lucan indicates with the strong enjambment of line 186. This huge specter of Rome, we're to imagine, interrupts Caesar just as he's about to cross. Virgil prefers to lay the groundwork for his apparition scenes with some transitional sequences, but Lucan gives us no indication that Rome is coming here. She appears so quickly, and so we're supposed to imagine, I think, that Caesar is right about to cross and she just comes up. Another diversion from Virgil is in the audience for the apparition. Traditionally, the apparition appears to its viewer alone, in moments of isolation. These scenes are often intensely private and personal. This saw it start in Patroclus's appearance to Achilles in Book 23 of the Iliad, and that tradition carries down through the Odyssey, through the Metamorphoses, and through the Aeneid. But Lucan's Roma appears at a very public and important moment. Caesar's army must be present for the crossing of the Rubicon. The apparition scene is actually immediately followed by the description of the military fording of the river. So Caesar's men must be here at the edge of the river as Caesar prepares to cross, but strangely, all indications point to them not seeing this giant ghost of Roma. So why does she appear to Caesar alone? Perhaps Lucan is accommodating a private encounter as a standard element of the topos, choosing to ignore Caesar's men for the sake of dramatic effect. He does manipulate scenes like this elsewhere in the poem. Another concession Lucan makes to the standard topos is the time of day when Roma appears. This river crossing is very unusually situated at night, despite it being standard military action to make river crossings during the day. You don't want guys on horseback stumbling around in the dark. But all three of Virgil's Book 2 apparitions also appear at night. So Lucan chooses to do it too. The nighttime setting also strengthens the connection between the fall of Troy, which was a night of terror, and what Lucan's arguing is this new night of terror, Caesar's invasion of Italy. Virgil also tends to include a phrase about the clearness of vision, despite potential difficulty with seeing, usually due to darkness, which is point 3 on the chart. Lucan accommodates this element by including the phrase clara proscura noctem, clearly through the murky night, a reference to Virgil's use of the same adjective, clarus, in 2 of his apparition scenes. But Lucan deviates from Virgil in one important area. He leaves out a striking detail found in all 3 of Virgil's Book 2 apparitions. The phrase ante oculos, or before the eyes. That's point 2 in the apparition chart. Virgil's reference to the organ of sight lends physicality to his apparitions. Hector, Venus, and Creüsa all appear, quote, before Aeneas' eyes. So Virgil's encouraging his reader to understand these apparitions as very real, even physical characters in his narrative. He doesn't want us spending any time wondering whether these entities actually exist. They exist for the characters, and so they exist for the reader. But Lucan chooses to leave the phrase ante oculos out of both of his major apparition scenes. It's possible that this is an instance of Lucan's own stoicism, preventing the poet from too openly vouching for the existence of the supernatural. He employs a further distancing technique with the passive form of the verb video, visa, in line 186. Roma only seems to appear to Caesar, but the poet won't confirm it. These small elements could hint at the poet's underlying suspicion of the supernatural. So, if Lucan is suggesting that his apparitions aren't real, either to his reader or to his characters, then what do they represent? The answer may lie in the Bellum Kiwile's other spectral entities. Lucan's other apparition scene, the vengeful Julia, comes bearing a dark message of guilt and punishment to her husband Pompey. She emphasizes the criminality of Pompey's action, not unlike Roma's chastisement of Caesar here. Book 7 features the only other specters in the epic as it survives. The ghosts of fathers and brothers haunt Caesar's troops after the bloody battle of Pharsalus. All of these apparitions shame their viewers for being participants in civil war, Caesar, Pompey, and Caesar's army. Lucan does not include the phrase before the eyes because his apparitions do not represent literal gods and ghouls as do Virgil's. In fact, the Bellum Kiwile consciously is devoid of a divine apparatus. Perhaps then, these apparitions function as manifestations of the character's psychological torment at participating in civil war. Or perhaps they're stand-ins for Lucan himself, condemning the participants. Both possibilities could be in play. So, Roma has made her appearance. Now she speaks to Caesar in a surprisingly brief address. This is points 5 to 7 on the Topos chart. Some address from the apparition is an element present in all epic apparition scenes, without exception. The universality of the trope reflects two important functions of the topos. First, as I mentioned before, apparitions accelerate the plot. And second, they convey vital information to the hero for his journey. This function finds its origin in Book 23 of the Iliad, where Achilles refuses to go to war after Patroclus dies, and then the ghost of Patroclus appears to him and tells him like he needs to go back to war. And so Patroclus essentially stops Achilles from stalling the epic anymore. He puts things into motion. Virgil's Aeneas delayed too. In Book 2, during the fall of Troy, he's detained first by sleep, and then by a drive to Homeric valor. So he's tarrying in the burning city until literally two ghosts and a goddess appear and tell him he needs to move on. All of these apparitions are performing the same basic functions. They're ending a delay, and they're revealing important information to the hero. Scholars have already noted Lucan's subversion of this function of the topos in the speeches of his ghosts. Vincent Huning summarizes, in the Bellum Kiwile, the speeches of epic apparitions neither further the action of the poem by disclosing the truth, nor expose what steps the hero should take. In effect, instead of ending delay, Lucan's apparitions are another agent of delay. They're characters which briefly halt the action of the poem, only to be quickly disregarded, with no impact on the intentions of their viewer or on the narrative as a whole. So here, instead of spurring Caesar on, we see Roma just trying to stop him. In fact, Roma's address to Caesar only shares one key element with speeches of Virgil's ghostly apparitions: syntactical simplicity. While straightforward syntax is certainly not limited to the speeches of ghosts in Virgil and Lucan, ghosts do speak in a noticeably simple style. Here, Roma addresses Caesar in short phrases, with sense units divided in small blocks of 2 or 4 words. Her vocabulary is plain and common. There are no complex grammatical constructions, no subordination, and we have a repetitive use of anaphora as well. These are aspects shared by the speeches of ghosts in Virgil, like Hector, and may in fact be a strong indication that Lucan's Roma could be interpreted as a ghost. But this is where the shared features end. In tone and in content, there are far more differences between Roma's speech and Virgil's speeches than similarities. Roma's entreaty to Caesar is strikingly brief. It's just a little over 2 full metrical lines. It's significantly shorter than those of Virgil's apparitions, which range from 13 to 18 lines. This brevity, I argue, underlines Roma's weakness. Lucan is basically defaming his apparition. He's making her request way shorter than Caesar's reply to her. Caesar's reply is 10 lines long, and this is barely 2. The shortness of Roma's speech is even more striking, given Lucan's usual MO. The Bellum Kiwile is a highly rhetorical and speech-heavy epic. Lucan's speeches tend to be really wordy. His average speech clocks in at approximately 21 lines long. They're long speeches. Virgil's speeches are only average out of 10. One scholar, Antony Snell, was trying to defend Lucan's style and admitted many of the speeches are in fact far too long. So Lucan is going to some effort to make Roma weak here. Her speech is brief, and it's also surprisingly mild. In their role as agents of action, epic apparitions almost always issue strong commands in the imperative voice. This is in fact one of the most common and defined aspects of the topos. It finds its origin in Patroclus' address to Achilles, and it appears in nearly every major apparition scene following. That's point 7 on the handout. So why are these apparitions so pushy? As supernatural figures, apparitions possess authority. They're privy to arcane knowledge, and they're made more powerful by their extra-human status. The mortal viewer is not in a position to argue with an apparition. This power discrepancy between the two is reflected in the strong tone apparitions usually take with their viewers. But Roma issues no direct prohibitive command to Caesar. She chooses instead to convey her request, not demand, via 2 rhetorical questions and a more general statement of legality. The simplicity of her address also makes Caesar more culpable in starting civil war. The boundaries have been very clearly and simply laid out by Roma herself, so when Caesar chooses to disregard the instructions, he takes on the full guilt of the action. So Roma has made her plea. Now we see Caesar's reaction. A detailed physical description of dread in the face of the supernatural. Surprisingly, there's been little work done so far on fear reactions in Roman poetry, so if anyone's looking for a project. There's a lot on prose, but not so much on poetry. This may be due to the deceptively codified appearance of the trope. Epic fear reactions tend to be quite brief. They're usually no more than 4 or 5 lines long, and they're comprised of a seemingly random assortment of standard elements, so like the hair stands on end, or the sweat goes cold, and things like that. I argue, however, that the fear language Lucan uses here in this Roma episode is not random at all, but actually carefully selected. For this project, I performed an in-depth study of fear vocabulary in the Aeneid and the Melancholia. I'll only summarize the results of that study here. But I believe that Lucan intended to contrast the emotional states of Aeneas and Caesar with the language that he chose to use here. The vocabulary in Virgil's passages suggests that Aeneas is surprised or taken aback, but he's not afraid. Whereas this language suggests that Caesar is stricken with dread at seeing this apparition. The example I'll draw from for my study is the use of the word horror. In Latin, the noun horror can refer to both the agent which incites fear, so think a really terrifying vision or a scary sound or something like that, and it can also refer to the fear itself. Virgil uses horror 7 times in his epic to indicate intense, heightened dread. Notably, he never uses horror in his apparition scenes. So this tells us that Aeneas is taken aback, as anyone would be if you're running through a burning city and suddenly a 10-foot-tall vision of the ghost of your wife appears in front of you, but he's not afraid of them. Lucan, on the other hand, does use horror for this Roma scene, and he also uses it in 2 other incredibly dreadful scenes in his epic: the apparition of Julia's ghost in book 3, and the pagan grove in book 3 as well. So we have to conclude that because Lucan uses horror here, he intended to define this as a distinctly horrific event for Caesar. Caesar feels here and only here in the entire epic something approximating fear. This fear makes him hesitate. One Latin word for hesitation is languor, which Lucan uses in line 194. It is languor, we are told, which holds Caesar's steps on the very edge of the Rubicon. Virgil never uses languor in any of his apparition scenes. So Lucan was looking really closely at these scenes, and he chose to kind of go off script, including this word. Lucan does have a real fondness for the concept of hesitation. Languor and its cognates occur 23 times in the Melancholia. But it's unusual that hesitation has the power to hold Caesar back at all, even for a moment. Lucan Caesar is not someone who really thinks twice about things or stops for anything. He's an agent of perpetual motion. So it's striking that he's the one who's standing stupefied here in front of this, as we've already talked about, relatively weak apparition. Lucan's machine of war is briefly occupied by a very uncharacteristic uncertainty. This reading is bolstered by his response to Roma, which is point 12 on the handout. This is super wordy. It's really defensive. He invokes several state deities, probably trying to underline his Romanness. He takes a full 5 lines before he even responds to Roma. There's a real desperation to his diction here, reflected in the extremely uncharacteristic repetition in line 203. One key word is the cognate of furia, furialibus, in line 200. The Latin word furia can be used of a public enemy. So, for example, Cicero called Clodius furia in the Procestia. So this solves the mystery of why Caesar is so stricken with dread. He's afraid of Roma, but not because she might cause him physical harm. She can't, as a particularly weak and ineffective apparition. He fears being labeled as a Clodius, a Catiline, a Hannibal. That is, he fears being labeled exactly what he is, an enemy of the state. But with the brashness typical of Lucan's characterization, Caesar takes no further delay to consider what should be done. Soon, we are told, he breaks the barriers of war, marching right through the apparition of Roma as the Rubicon swells in protest. Using the apparition topos proves especially useful in drawing conclusions about Lucan's vision of Roma. A broader umbrella topos means we don't need to ask whether Roma should be considered a ghost or a god. Indeed, there would be many difficulties in attempting to subcategorize her in this way. But certain details of Roma's physical appearance, her white flowing hair, her simple speech, suggest that she shares many characteristics with ghosts. But, unlike a ghost, Roma is not yet dead. From the perspective of the poem, the civil war is not yet lost. Octavian has not yet won the Battle of Actium in 31. Any number of historical events Lucan might attribute as the death blow of the Republic have yet to occur. So maybe we see the ghostly Roma focalized through the perspective of an audience member, or Lucan himself, rather than through the character of Caesar. Lucan's audience, all too familiar with the tyranny of imperial rule, is given a glimpse back to the crossroads moment over 100 years before. With the knowledge that Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon is the symbolic act which kills the Republic, even if it's not the final blow, the reader sees the ghost of Roma appear to her killer right before he strikes. In any case, Roma's apparition is intended to be a negative experience for the reader, one which inverts many expected elements of Virgil's apparition scenes, and which points ultimately not to a hopeful future, but to the destruction of Rome. To conclude, this talk, I hope, can be seen as a focused application of my apparition topos, and as an example of the kind of results that this application can yield. I intend to provide a more flexible means of analyzing apparition scenes, one which requires no concessions, but instead examines these supernatural visitations as they were conceived of by the ancients, holistically and with attention given to a wide variety of supernatural beings. Thank you.
Thank you for this. It's really interesting and lovely to look at a piece of Latin. So thank you for that. This is really interesting to me, and I think very brave for spending so much time with Lucan. I definitely am not.
I hope I've converted you.
But I was really interested looking at this at Caesar's response and how sort of tightly knit the end of it is to the end of Roma's injunction, and you know, how he seems to be very aware of exactly what she's saying to him, and then completely
Yeah.
both equivocating and then choosing opposite language.
He's making excuses, right?
Right.
And then once he feels like he's justified himself, and you picked up on something really interesting about the scene. So a lot of these apparition scenes, like you might be familiar with the ones, especially with the lovers, like Patroclus or something, where the guy will try to like embrace and then, but the apparition leaves. So it's one of the functions, I think it's point 12, that the apparition, usually there's a part where the apparition like speaks, but we don't have that here. Caesar apparently just like finishes his speech and then just walks right through, like that's it. So yeah, it's definitely goes to his characterization, I guess.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's really interesting how, you know, she says very simply, situates topos licet, and then he says licet modo,
Yeah.
you know, no quoque.
Yeah.
So he's saying everywhere else I've been, and then so now here too.
So I'm
even though you said here no.
No, exactly.
And then you know, to choose miles or to say miles in contrast to the keyways is just so.
Definitely, and I mean, and it kind of underlines that thread I was trying to connect, where it's like she's saying if you're a citizen, and he's like, I'm a citizen. Here's all the Roman gods that I know, and I don't want to be. I'm not a cannibal. Like, why are you acting like I'm doing something? You know, but what he's doing actually is harmful to her, obviously. But he kind of like talks his way out of it.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, Caesar and miles are both in the same word position in the line.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if there's something here at the end of this where he's sort of breaking through this liminal space and like really identifying himself in a different, as a barrier breaking person.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think any chance that you have to read Lucan as breaking a barrier in some way, you're making the right choice. Because not only is he obsessed with these sorts of boundaries, you know, between crime and the right thing to do, he's also obsessed with bodily integrity. So he's all about kind of mutilations and that kind of thing, and supernatural encounters, which again exist in that weird liminal space. So that's probably one of the defining aspects of his style. So yeah, those were really great observations. Thank you. Yeah.
Like having a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's actually, for me it seems like he's trying to convince her, not trying to take her with her, because it's something that we see actually during the Roman years. Pax Deorum before Pax Romana, and tries to convince Rome that come with me in this battle in order to, win, because I'm not your enemy. It's the man that awaits beyond the river.
Yeah.
It's something that has always been there. I mean, and right now it seems that it also follows, maybe not marching for Pax Romana, but he does going against Pax Deorum. I mean,
Yeah, no, you're definitely picking up on something there. So when he says Ille erit, Ille noctis, that guy's going to be the bad guy, he's talking about Pompey, who's on the other side of the war. So this is one of Lucan's big things, like, when I was talking about him being an agent, like he's a poet of delay, all he's ever doing is delaying, everything's a delay. Lucan's thing is kind of, civil war is a crime to talk about, like this is the worst possible thing that could happen. So I'm going to delay it all the time to stop telling the narrative. That's kind of his thing. So the kind of concentrating on like Caesar trying to displace blame on the other participant of civil war, when it's like the joke is all of you are criminals because you're all participants in civil war. That's like Lucan's, that's his message, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, I do have one, yeah. How does the, I guess, Lucan's engagement with ghosts, gods, how does that inform that debate about Lucan's interest in kind of stoicism in his work?
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, that's kind of one of the big issues for Lucan scholars and also scholars of Seneca, Seneca the Younger, who is Lucan's uncle. Why are they Stoics? In that they are all about fate and fortune and kind of defined end and self-control and all that. And then they're also writing these incredibly macabre, bloody, ridiculous, emotional works. This is something every Lucan or Seneca scholar has to decide for themselves. I honestly kind of fall on the side of because it's fun. I think they just liked it. It was the attitude of the time. Like Nero's court, there were lots of works like this that were quite violent and kind of had occult elements and things like that. It was the taste of the time, and I think Seneca probably influenced Lucan in this as well. But ultimately, I mean, this isn't to say, I mean, there are tons of Stoic elements in Lucan. One of his third hero, who's introduced a bit later, Cato, is kind of like the embodiment of Stoicism. He's very stodgy. And there's also a theme of suicide that kind of persists throughout the work, and that's kind of seen as a Stoic element as well, in that they choose to end their own lives instead of submit to tyranny. Thanks for coming.
And we can continue the discussion less formally over a glass of wine. Because it's our last event before the holidays, we have mulled wine. When you stand up, please fold your chairs and put them against the bookshelf so we have a little space. Thank you, and thank you, Emma, once again.